Well, good morning, fellas. And here we are once again at the Moot House. And we're looking at our study, What is a Man? And we're looking at the life of Jacob, as you are well aware. And in our study, of course, you've seen this slide week after week, and we are here right at this point. And we're looking at this, what I think is a transformational occasion in this man's life. I am fascinated by this story, as you are already aware of this wrestling match, Jacob's wrestling match. And I think it's just so, got so much meaning in it for us, especially at this stage of life. So that's what we're looking at. And as again, when we started this back in week 16, looking at this particular text, I did an outline of it, just kind of broad strokes, just to get our arms around it. Came up with three, what I would call movements within this text. The first is the struggle, and then this struggle with this opponent has purpose. And there is a definite outcomes of this struggle, this wrestling match, and we've been looking at that. And so we take those three words: struggle, purpose, and something new. And we now look at the text, and I've color coded it, and I am color blind, which I don't know if you guys know that, but I am. But is this red?
Yes.
Yeah. Red, black, and green, correct? Okay, that's what I thought. So what I did is, within the text itself, I color-coded it, and just to get the flow of the text, that there are texts, there are words and descriptions about struggle, and then we get then to the purpose of this whole thing, and then there are outcomes of that. So let's go ahead and read the text. If someone could read the text, verses 24 through 32.
Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh. So the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the dawn is breaking." But he said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." So he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." He said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him and said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. So Jacob named the place Peniel, for he said, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been preserved." Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Peniel, and he was limping in his thigh. Therefore to this day the sons of Israel do not eat the sinew of which the hip is on, and the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh in the sinew of the hip.
Thanks, Dave. All right. So we take those three words, and we've now transposed them in this chart that we looked at last week: struggle, purpose, and something new as an outcome. And then, as last week, we went through and I wrote a descriptive paragraph, couple sentences under each. First of all, Jacob begins to overcome his, and that term that we've been using, guys, his imprinted separateness. And of course that goes back, I don't know, that's a new term to you, Rod, but it's something that I have coined to basically describe what occurred in Genesis chapter 3, is that the man and the woman became separate. And it's this ingrained, it's how I am describing sin, the sin nature. And that sin nature drives us to greater degrees of separateness. So he's overcoming his imprinted separateness through engaging in the struggle. This is critical. And in my, again, you're hearing it from my perspective. I think the very fact that he's engaging, he's overcoming what our natural propensity as human beings is to continue to stay in our pain and our separateness. But Jacob is now at a point in life, through his experiences and through his pain, that's now driving him to engage God. And that is something that is a marvelous, that's a step towards transformation. He's engaging this process, and that's thus overcoming this idea of staying isolated. Regardless of how he, or anyone for that matter, arrives at this point, in order to move on, one must exercise trust. And that is what we've already talked about this, that trust is a key component. And I'm using the word, Rod, trust versus faith, because I think it puts it more into the now. But they're the same, the same thing. Through the struggle, Jacob moves from attempting to conquer early on in this engagement to hanging on. And guys, I just find that so fascinating, and it's so descriptive of the transformation process that we all go through. There is this innate resistance within us as men and human beings to resist what is negative, to pull back, to stay separate. And through this process of this night wrestling match in the dark, he's now, no, I'm going to hang on. I want more. Now, isn't that true of our experience as we're engaging God? We have to talk about inputting disciplines in our life in seeking God, in investing in a relationship with God. There are barriers to overcome. And so I'm seeing this as a picture. It's all taking place in an evening, but it could take place over years or decades of this engagement with God. But the outcome of that is, I don't want to let go. And I think of the words of the disciples, where else are we going to go? Will you too leave? No, where else will we go? So, from conquering to clinging. And I think it's a beautiful picture. Jacob refuses to let go until he receives something new. He wants to be blessed. And of course, we talked last week about how, Jacob was always the one seeking the blessing, the one up. But we also, so Jacob is still Jacob, but he has found what he's, in my opinion, what he's longed for his entire life. And then I've got a note here that I think the dawning, this is all happening at dawning. The dawning is a picture of what's happening in Jacob's experience. He's becoming awakened to a new realm, a new reality. Jacob's self-induced, these are the outcomes. Jacob's self-induced internal war has ended. And I say that it's not only Jacob, but it's you and I. There's a self-induced, we put ourselves, because of our separateness, our sinful nature, into self-induced prisons, self-induced pain. And his war, or this conflict, he now receives a new name. Notice identity. His name is changed from Jacob to Israel. And will now walk in a dependent power, the limp. He has become a participant within a much larger framework. I'm stating that from his perspective. He now sees differently, and there, for the first time, a convergence towards a unified whole. That key word is convergence, is, instead of a life that is fragmented and anxious and needing to control and needing to overcome and doing it. It's a life. It's a life that now can see a much larger picture and ourselves as a role to play. And Jacob becomes comfortable in this role that God has given him. And that's where we're headed, men, in this transformational process. You know, we get to a point where we don't have to win anymore, but we can take the place that God has given us and play that role and be satisfied with that. So that's just mere review. And then what we did last week, and to bring it down home, is I've taken these 3 words and I've transposed some some outlines over here. I would call this phase of our life, guys, that we're going through with Jacob, this struggle, and in the story, it's a picture of the way of the cross. Jesus said, whoever will follow me must take up his cross and follow him. And we look at the life of Jesus, and we look at the life of people who have gone before us. And this struggle, it's not easy because of this ingrained separateness. But I look at that, the way of the cross. And then the way of the cross leads to a death on a cross. Death to self. Death on a cross. And Jesus was the example of that, and he says, follow me. But at least in my belief, and I think we're all in agreement here, that a resurrection always follows a death. If there is a death, there will be a resurrection. There was a death at a point in time, and there was a resurrection 3 days later. But there are, guys, also, there are deaths every day, and there are resurrections every day. And it's, I've given you the story of John Wimber, that a man who had a big influence on me and how I think. And there was a time in John Wimber's life, I think, Jeff, you and I were talking about this last week, is that John Wimber was engaged in his ministry, very active, very successful, and he was just worn out and ready to quit. He was at the pinnacle. Is this all there is? And the story goes, he talks about this. He says, one night I was going to bed and I felt the Lord speak to me, and I felt the Lord say to me, John, I've seen your ministry. Now let me show you mine. And I love that. I have never forgotten that. And that's what we're talking about, death to self. And through that, if we just let go, there is a resurrection. And by golly, it takes a few years to walk that out. So there's that. And then we went through yet a second time, transposing yet a second outline over it. And I'm getting this from the book that John White gave me and that we've been enjoying and discussing together, called Life Without Want? Lack. Life Without Lack, Dallas Willard book. And he outlines this process in the book. This is the main thesis for the book, is that there's a trust here. We're learning to trust in this area of struggle. It comes to a death to self. And then there's a new walk that is depicted by love, a new walk of love. That there's a resurrection. It's the same idea. And then I did it one more time through what the Apostle Paul writes in the epistles. He talked several times in the epistles this idea of putting off. We are called as Christians to put something off, put it aside, and to put something, putting on Christ. So the writers of the New Testament, examples throughout history, what I'm saying is that this picture in here in Genesis 32 is a picture of this process as transformation. And it may be, as in the story, a concentrated period of time, or guys, maybe, just maybe, it may take years and or decades to work through this process. Yeah. So moving from struggle, the attempting to conquer, to here with allowing ourselves to be conquered. And it's so ironic that term, when he's wrestling with this being who I think is the pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. I mean, that's my opinion. God himself, he says, you prevailed. Your name now is Israel. Let's talk about prevailing. Well, he's prevailing through letting go, which is so interesting. So, what I'd like for us to do today is spend the rest of the time, and we've got about 20 minutes. Maybe I'll gather us together just short of that. But I'd like each of us here in the room to think about this in regard to our own journey. And got the slide up here. Which words or phrases listed below best describes your current place within your journey? Is it over in this realm or here or here? And then at the table, we'll do this in tables, and I'll join this table right here. Explain why you think so. So it's an easy exercise. So let's have some fun with it.